This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in imposing my thinly undiagnosed ADHD on others. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm here with Malcolm Guite, English poet, singer, and songwriter, scholar of English literature, poetry, and the Inklings, and Anglican priest. He is the author of several excellent books of English poetry, including The Singing Bowl, Sounding the Seasons, Word in the Wilderness, Waiting on the Word, Parable and Paradox, Love, Remember, After Prayer, and David's Crown, Sounding the Psalms. He is currently working on a poetic rendition of the Arthuriad, or the Matter of Britain, which is what principally brings us together today, apart from the fact that I'm simply a huge fan. Malcolm, welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm both honored and completely delighted.
Here. I'm very impressed by the list of books you managed to reel off there. Sometimes I forget. So thank you for finding that out and being engaged with that. And indeed, yeah, I was glad to accept your invitation because I've been meaning to turn to the Matter of Britain for a very long time. It's been a long, slow theme in my life, but recently it's really come into the fore and into focus. So it's good to be able to reflect on it with somebody else.
Yeah, I'm just delighted to talk about it. Most of my friends who have similar training to me have not yet turned that training towards Arthuriana. Most of my friends who are into Arthuriana are far afield. So this is a nice way of getting into it. Malcolm, the conversation that I pitched to you today is on the Matter of Britain and modern reception, kind of moving through its reception history to how contemporary people in Britain, America, and elsewhere are continuing to make sense of these stories. But I'm curious first, when and how did Arthur become important, especially to you, both in terms of identity and poetic work? So you've talked in other venues about, your trifold upbringing in Nigeria and Canada and Britain, and the struggle over British identity. I'm curious if Arthuriana factors into this at all.
Okay, my first encounter with Arthuriana, it was, perhaps as it should be, not through reading. I was almost pre-literate when the first things happened, but through my mother, who, as well as being she's an amazing woman, and the woman from whom, in a sense, the poetry in my life comes, who often quoted poetry, but as well as often quoting and reciting poetry, she was a great storyteller and retained stories and told them very well. And she was a historian and knew her Mallory extremely well, as well as some of the other retellings. And she used to tell me when I was a little boy stories from Mallory. I mean, to some degree, slightly edited now that I'm reading the original Mallory, but to suit my age, but essentially filled me with this sense of how marvelous it must be to be a knight and to ride off. And the thing she always impressed upon me was the way the knights, she used phrases from Mallory. So she'd say, Lancelot and Percival rode out into the wild woods and said to one another, "Let us take the adventure that God sends," which is pretty, that you don't know what's going to happen. You don't go out with a plan or a map. So she told me various of the stories, and she told me stories that aren't in Mallory, but which she knew from other sources. So it was from my mother first that I heard the story of Gawain and the Green Knight. Eventually, I studied the original medieval text and, of course, looked at Tolkien's beautiful edition. But of all those stories, the ones that moved me most, the knight that I associated with was Galahad. And it was the stories about the Grail that attracted me. I'm not quite sure what it was that drew me to Galahad. I think it was partly, I was never the boy at school who was good at sports or full of prowess. And I kind of recognized that the likes of Gawain and Lancelot in particular were, as it were, in their own world, the kind of boys who were captain of the sports team. And I was never that kind of boy. So there was something, as it were, slightly uncanny, something phased, something intuitive. I now see something sacred about Galahad and his adventures. So I used to pretend to be Sir Galahad, and I would do this when we were living in Zimbabwe, and we had a garden with many terraces that went down in sort of winding bits, and I used to sort of, pretend to be on a horse and ride up. And my mother made me a shield and covered it in embroidered cloth, and somebody carved me a wooden sword. So I played at these things long before I came to them as a written text. And so when I came to them as a written text, although I did eventually study them and I was aware in the end of all the intellectual apparatus about the reception history, all that kind of caper, there's always been an element of enchantment and play for me in these things. And I became interested eventually in the various retellings. And at some point in my life, probably around the same times as my first stirrings of real poetic vocation in my late teens or early 20s, I wondered if I might have a go at them. But of course, then in the 70s, you know, in the late 70s, really the tide seemed to be turned against the English poetic tide. Nobody was writing epic, nobody was writing a long thing, you know. I couldn't even see that anybody was doing the Arthurian things particularly. I had T.H. White, of course. I also had, and again, my mother had given me this so I could read them on my own, Roger Lancelyn Green's rather fine retelling of the Arthurian stories for children or for young people, which was published by Puffin. And I'm now looking at that again with a view to my own retellings. It's very skillfully done. And of course, he was doing it in conversation with the likes of C.S. Lewis, of whom he was a friend and student, and of whom he was, of course, the first biographer. So, he also did retellings of the legends of Asgard and the Greek stories and so on. He was a great popularizer of classic myth and legend, and he didn't dumb them down or demythologize the myth in any way. He understood, because he was really au fait with all the Inklings, he understood what mythopoetic writing was. So he was very good. I had it from that. But apart from him and T.H. White, who was slightly earlier, I couldn't find any, you know, if you like, accessible popular retellings. I became aware, of course, that very high-end modernists, that in his own extremely oblique way, Eliot was touching on that stuff in The Wasteland. And then I became aware of David Jones, the great Welsh poet and painter, who touches on it, you know, in a very high modernist way. And then, of course, by the time I graduated, I'd got myself back into the Inklings in quite a big way. And I came across and fell in love with the poetry of Charles Williams. And I realized that Charles Williams was had this poetic sequence, which isn't a straight narrative sequence at all, but is a series of poetic reflections on episodes in the matter of Britain, which put together tell the story, but not in chronological order at all. I subsequently found, of course, the beautiful rare book, the Arthurian Torso, which C.S. Lewis published after Williams's death, which contains an unfinished fragment of a book Williams was intending to write about the Arthuriad, called The Figure of Arthur, to be a companion volume with his great book, The Figure of Beatrice, about Dante. And Lewis publishes all that's extant of that. And then his own rather methodical commentary on Williams's poetry, in which he says, we can't be doing with William's original order because sense. Here, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to rearrange the poems for you in order of events, which I'm sure is not what Williams wanted. But so I was aware of that very high-end stuff, and I was aware of the popular stuff, and there was seemed to be nothing in between. So yeah, that's rather a long answer to a short question, but I've never been able to quite let the matter.
That's really good. And I think I feel what you're talking about with regard to you know, this desire both to go back to the text, sort of go back to the manuscripts and go back to the original tellings, but also there's a real value in the popularizers, right? Sort of every era.
Well, because these original tellings, which now tend to be read by scholars, were popular. I mean, They were massively popular. Of course, they were a form of courtly literature. So they weren't popular in quite the same way that a broadside ballad was popular. But among I mean, because they were tales of courtesy, because right across the whole of Europe, you know, the court of Arthur, Camelot, was the iconic center of high chivalry and courtly love. So it had all the chivalry to do with the knights, and then it had the whole courtly love theme because it carried with it the stories of both Lancelot and Guinevere and Tristan and Isolde, which are both kind of classic courtly love stories. So all those things were flowing together. When I really came to study it more fully, one of the things that really struck me was how comprehensively European the Arthurian literature is. Of course, we have Mallory, but Mallory is constantly telling you he's got it out of the French book, as he calls it, which is probably Chrétien de Troyes. Obviously, we now, if you look at the broad sources now, you have the earliest original sources in fragments of Welsh. You have both the storytelling and the kind of, rather propagandistic inventions of Geoffrey of Monmouth in the Historia Regione, and then you've got this alliterative mort data, which of course later we now know Tolkien was working on his known remaking of, and probably Mallory was aware of the alliterative mort data, and then you had odd manuscripts like Gawain and the Green Knight that didn't seem to link to any of the rest of the cycle, but were glorious things in themselves. I now know that there were also some broadside ballads, and that really interests me because that's poetry and it's also popular, and it bridges that gap and finds that middle space that I think needs to be filled between a straight kind of popular retelling for kids, but that often misses out the whole mystical element and also tends to miss out the darker sides, the dark things that are redeemed or need redeeming in the story, or these extremely arcane, highly elusive poetic texts like David Jones's In Parenthesis or Anathemata, which are really about something else, but which constantly allude to the Arthurian story. I just felt there's something missing here in the middle of them. But I also became aware of how every generation that has retold that story, once I got onto the Victorians and read Tennyson and so on, I really began to see how every age looks, as it were, into the mirror of the matter of Britain and sees both what is fair and what is foul in its own reflection and seeks a wisdom for its own age out of that mystery. And every retelling is necessarily also a contemporary poem. I mean, contemporary to the writer of the poem, as well as a poem that looks back to a mythic or heroic past.
Right. And so this kind of leads me into my next couple of questions, I think. So, I mean, there's a bit in the Inklings and King Arthur, there's a very short section where they talk about, the so-called historical Arthur. My graduate background is in biblical studies and classics, so I'm almost singularly uninterested in the questions of historicity when it comes to myth a lot of the time. But I'm curious, like in terms of the essential myth, in terms of the Arthuriad, what is its basic shape? Can we walk through what the fundamental narratives are? And what are some of those contemporary meanings as they've evolved over history? I'm especially curious if the matter of Britain or Logres has been influential for poets that I know to have captured your literary attention and imagination, like Coleridge or Keats or Yeats or,
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's a very big question.
A very big question. Tackle it however you like.
Another poet in there, because one of the sort of great literary might-have-beens is Milton's original intention, before he decided to do Paradise Lost instead, was to write an Arthurian poem. And he was going to do it about Arthur's adventures in the underworld. I mean, he was going to do, had some episode where Arthur goes down. I mean, obviously, the medieval alliterative poems say that Arthur, for a while, was brought up with the elves. So he might have been done underground in the sense of under the hill in Fairy. Or it might have been, literally he goes down, it's sort of almost like a kind of inferno, And C.S. Lewis, commenting on that, says that people think, oh, golly, it would have been awful to have had these great, big, ponderous, Miltonic, verse paragraphs trying to tell a romance. It wouldn't have suited. But of course, as Lewis points out, Milton was a much greater poet than that. Milton used the grand style that he had developed for Paradise Lost because it suited Paradise Lost, which is basically Genesis meets the Aeneid. Whereas Milton's first poetic inspirer and love was Spenser. And that's why Milton would have been interested in Arthur, because Spenser's frame is at least Arthurian, in The Faerie Queene. So probably Milton's unwritten Arthurian epic would have been probably felt more Spenserian than Miltonic. It would have been brilliant. I mean, I wish you'd done it. Sorry, I'm going to have to stop this phone from going off. Anyway, to go back to where we are. So you were asking, you were asking two questions, really. You were asking, what's the overall shape of the narrative? You're also implicitly saying, what's my take on the difference between the historical Arthur and the mythological Arthur?
Sure,
and then
sure.
then you were asking, who are the poets that have picked it up? So it's quite a lot. Three things really.
Well, and so the shape of the narrative, right, is in large part determined by the reception, right, and by the development, and by what Arthur has meant to different generations. So maybe that's what I was going for, but one too many questions, certainly. So whichever one you're interested in.
Yeah. So as to what is the shape of the narrative, thereby hang many tales, because different narrators have picked up the threads in different ways. And as you say, that's partly to do with their own take on it. My sense of the overarching, as it were, arc of it is probably pretty firmly shaped by Mallory. But the real question is the importance of the different narrative elements. The other person who shaped a lot of our feelings about Arthur, even if we haven't read him, is Tennyson, because the Idylls of the King was so influential. I think the first thing I'd want to say is that much as I love the Tennyson, I agree with Charles Williams, and this is Charles Williams's direct critique of Tennyson, that there's a fundamental weakness in Tennyson's account of it, which is that he doesn't pay sufficient attention to. Indeed, in many ways, he kind of dismisses the Holy Grail, even though there is a book within the Idylls on the Holy Grail. He takes the view, you can see Tennyson feels that in a way the Holy Grail is a tragic distraction, that if only all these knights who had no business to do it and weren't fully qualified, because only Galahad could really be the Grail knight, if only they hadn't all gone off in pursuit of the Grail, the Camelot might have carried on, it wouldn't have been greatly weakened. Mordred wouldn't have had his opportunity to come in, etc., etc. And he feels that implicitly in Tennyson's symbolic meaning, Tennyson's trying to be an inspired social reformer and enthusiastic about human progress, and sees this sudden inshaft of the divine and the kind of kindling of a holy calling amidst the world as as a distraction, that perhaps there's even a bit of a sort of hangover of Reformed Protestant suspicion of Catholic mysticism going on. Now, Williams says Tennyson's simply wrong about that, and that the Grail is essential. In fact, in Williams's view, Camelot exists for the Grail. The point about Camelot, the whole point about all the work that was done by Joseph of Arimathea and all the special keepers of the Hallows and the whole tradition that eventually led to the Fisher King, and all of that was in the hope that by the Round Table and the Siege Perilous, and by that such a union of the sacred and the secular would occur, that a kingdom which was really blessed with a Christian king and a new code of love and chivalry would come into being, such that the Grail could come to Camelot and be there. And in a sense, God's kingdom would come on earth. The parousia would happen. But the combination of Lancelot's sin, of all the various tragedies and things like that, meant that in the end, although the Grail is achieved by one of Arthur's knights, as Merlin had prophesied when he made the Siege Perilous, in a sense, it has to be taken back up to heaven. There's a kind of apotheosis, and Galahad is almost one with the Grail, and the Grail must await another time, and perhaps the return of Arthur for I mean, in a sense, Earth is always being taken up into heaven in the Grail, but the truth was that the Grail was meant to bring heaven to Earth. And so for Williams, the Grail is the absolute core and heart of the whole thing. And he feels that Tennyson doesn't get that right at all and isn't really capable of it. I think it's a bit hard on Tennyson, but I essentially agree with him. So if you think the Grail is the most important thing, then your whole sense of the shape of the narrative is very different. The other thing, though, I think where Williams is absolutely right, and this is really one of the things that animates me in my own retelling, is that at the times that Williams was really getting into the Arthurian stuff, which he did partly because he was in the Order of the Golden Dawn and, you know, A.E. Waite's mystical Church of the Cross, all of that. But he was also a Christian all the way through, in my view. He was a Christian mystic of a particularly mystical type. But where he's right, and if you read his Figure of Arthur, which is the first part of the Arthurian torso, he makes this point really clearly. But at the time that he was writing, everybody was still under the influence of Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, and a kind of comparative anthropology. And everybody, it was The Golden Bough and all its subsequent, and all the people like Jessie Weston from Ritual to Romance, which then influenced Eliot, all those people were syncretistic for starting. So they regarded any one set of religious symbols as equivalent to any other set of religious symbols and didn't really understand any distinctions. Further, of course, because they were all, as it were, in the decadence as they perceived it as a Christian culture and wanted to get out from under that shadow, if anything, they tended to denigrate the Christian side of it. So they seized on the Golden Bough and said, well, clearly the Grail is a memory of or a recrudescence of a pre-Christian series of Celtic cup and cauldron symbols, and it's the cauldron of plenty and its various magical cups of transformation. And they read against the grain of the primary texts, because Chrétien de Troyes and Mallory are absolutely, they have a really lucid and coherent theology of the Grail. And it really does depend on Christ, and it really does depend on a physical thing having been brought, you know, and it really is about the Eucharist. And in the end, it's a meeting between a powerful theology of the real presence, which at the time that those texts was being written, as Williams demonstrated, was coming to the fore and was beautifully formulated and extremely carefully thought through. And what they were doing was taking very high academic, you know, there were Cistercian monks who wrote these things, you know, they were taking very high-end academic theology and re-expressing it through magic and romance in the most fruitful and luminous way. Now, of course, what they did was to pick up pre-Christian motifs, but they brought them to Christ, and they were transfigured in Christ like everything else that's brought to Christ. Whereas the Jessie Westons and T.S. Eliots and Joyce's and all that Bloomsbury high modernist set had quite the opposite agenda. And Williams, although he was a great friend of Eliot's and himself used a great deal of modernist technique in his Arthurian poetry, was dead set against that that de-Christianizing of the Grail. And I think he was right there. So for me, you know, I would see the narrative, the real narrative arc of the Arthuriad as starting at the Last Supper. And then going, and that's the prototype of the Round Table, and that this gathering of a company, one of whom is a traitor, is repeated again and again until finally we have the Round Table and we have Mordred, and that you know, one of whom is a traitor and the other of whom is the beloved disciple and the young man, you know, who runs who lies with his head on the breast of Christ and is intimately close to him. And in the final reiteration of all of that, that's Galahad. And, you know, the resonances all the way through are just vital for the whole thing, and can't be underplayed, I think.
Yeah. All of that's fantastic. My mind immediately jumped when you were mentioning, you know, pagan motifs or Celtic motifs of like the Cauldron of Plenty or what have you. Was, you know, I mean, Lewis, of course, would hear that and just instantly go, well, yeah, of course it is. And it's the Eucharist, right?
And it's, yeah, that's the point. I'm not saying it's not those things, but I'm saying it becomes what it is by becoming the Eucharist. And the people, the sort of Jessie Westons and others of this world didn't get it because they really didn't know what the Eucharist was. They thought all these things were equivalents and they'd rather have the pagan one than the Christian one. What they didn't understand is, you know, what earth has given and human hands have made, that in the Eucharist, the whole creation, including the mythic creation, perhaps especially the mythic subcreation, is all brought to Christ and becomes itself. It becomes the thing. There really is a cauldron of plenty, you know, and there really is a cup of healing, and you know. But the other thing, of course, that was affecting all of that generation of the 20s and 30s was not only Fraser, who was a bit further back, but of course Freud and later Jung, but mainly Freud. So they simply could not see. There was, as soon as they saw that there was in the Grail procession a spear and a cup, they just had to read that, not only just in gender, but it's sexualized reading of it. And they, because the Fisher King is wounded in the thighs, and because his wound is related to the loss of fertility in the land. Now, all of that's true, of course. There is a fertility element. There is a thing about sexual wounding, but those are all taken up into and transfigured by something else. And in the end, it's not a phallic symbol alone. It's the spear of Longinus. It's the spear that pierced Christ. You know, that's the point. All these things are, you know. So I think we need to lift it out of that. I think finally, not only syncretism, but ultimately reductive reading of symbol into something much more mysterious and transformative.
Well, we see this in biblical studies too, right? So, you know, if you read the Gospels closely and you make conclusions like, say, what M. David Litwaw writes about at length, that like, look, you know, there are certain cultural expectations in the Mediterranean of what gods do. If you read the Gospels in comparison with Greco-Roman literature, in addition to with Jewish literature, you find that like Jesus is being written about like many other Mediterranean gods. And it's like, yeah. And if that bothers you, you're coming to the text with expectations that make it something other than a text, right? Or if that bothers you, then your theology is dependent on the opposite of what you were saying, right?
Yeah.
That like,
and of course, this is what's going on in the conversation between Lewis and Tolkien all the time, you know.
right.
This is myth made history. The motifs are the same, you know, the corn god and the wine god and the dying, and they've been dying and rising gods, you know. But if you read the narratives, the mythical narratives in the other things, they don't make any historical claims at all. They don't say under Pontius Pilate or while Quirinius was governor of Syria, you know. They're timeless stories. But here, the timeless story actually happens in history. But the interesting thing is that it happens amongst a people who had been specifically forbidden to have all those myths and legends. It's almost though they've been purified, so they don't spot it. They actually perceive it as a historico-political event, which it is. And in the end, when the gospel then comes out to the Gentiles' jaws drop to the floor and say, oh my goodness, the stuff we've always dreamed of has actually happened in real life, in the world, and we can be part of it.
Yeah, when I talk to some of my more evangelical friends on a topic related to this, like Mariology or something, for example, and you know, I often find that in explaining like something like a Christian doctrine of the saints that comes out of that, you know, progress of the gospel to the Gentiles, right? And I'm trying to explain what's going on here. And a lot of the time, my friends want me to clarify for them, like, we're not worshiping the saints as gods, right? Or we're not worshiping Mary as a goddess. And sometimes I find it's useful to say, no, right? Like, they're not gods. She's not a goddess. That's not what's going on. And then other times I find it more useful to be a little provocative and say, no, that's exactly what's going on. Like, you've got it right. Right? Like,
yeah,
like Mary's a goddess, the saints are gods. That's exactly what's happening. Like, you know, you understand. And I think it's because that
all those moon goddesses were expressing a need for and pointing towards what is in fact a primal spirituality, which is the maiden through whom God came into the world, who is both maid and mother. But of course, in the pagan things, there are the mother goddesses on the one hand and the maiden goddesses on the other. And C.S. Lewis, of course, just prior to his conversion, wrote a poem about two of them, about Athene and Demeter, and said, just prior to conversion, oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make a concord of the depth and height, you know. Do you know that poem?
I've definitely read it.
It's the poem that begins, set on the soul's acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light, and he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white, so clear is reason. But how dark, imagining, warm, dark, and infinite, you know. And then he says, tempt not Athene, wound not Demeter in her mother, right? Oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? Well, the answer is Jesus Christ. And, who will make a concord of the depth and height? It's almost a riff on Ephesians, that you may know the length. And of course, Jesus Christ comes into the world precisely through somebody who is both maid and mother.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point.
Well, and I'm thinking,
there,
oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, one of the problems for us, I think, who are trained at a certain time in biblical scholarship is that, the influence of somebody like Bultmann and the whole program of demythologizing, it's another example of reading against the text instead of reading with the text. Mm-hmm. And so we were all taught to kind of minimize or be embarrassed by these supernatural resonances and go for this kind of historic figure, and that's simply not what the text is doing. Mm-hmm. And you can't work with it like that. You have to, the text must make you look at the world in a different way, rather than you insisting that the text looks at the world your way.
Yeah, exactly right. And I here have to give a shout out to my supervisor at Missouri State. When I did my master's in religious studies there, Leslie Baines, who's working on a book on C.S. Lewis and biblical scholarship. Because Lewis wrote quite a bit actually about contemporary biblical scholarship, and
the famous essay "Turn Seeing Elephants."
Yeah, he seems to have interacted with Bultmann. I was thinking as you were talking too about that poem, it's interesting how we have in some ways kind of erased the way that Christianity absorbed classical Greco-Roman culture in so many ways. So like the Parthenon, right? The Temple of Athene. Yeah. It was a Christian church to the Theotokos much longer than it was a pagan temple, right?
Exactly.
And we
right so.
Yeah, and we've stripped it. We've completely stripped it. The point is,
it became, in my view, and certainly this would be Lewis's view, once Christ has come, in a sense, the old order is over. We can't go back to, and we should not go back to worshipping pagan gods and goddesses. But all the pagan gods and goddesses must come to Christ and become what they were truly meant to be, which means leaving some things behind. Mm-hmm. But it does mean finding a fulfillment. I always think that the really good example of that is in Prince Caspian, when Aslan summons not only a river god to break the bridge, but summons Dionysus. And that's, my goodness, Dionysus is always Bacchus and Silenus. And then there's a great thing where they have a romp. It's a wonderful.
It's my favorite moment in the whole.
All of this is, of course, missed out of the American film, because there's too much people. But there's a wonderful moment when they all collapse and says, "That was lovely with Bacchus." And then Susan, who's always the sensible one, says, Lucy says, "That was lovely, but I shouldn't have felt quite safe with Bacchus and his fierce Maenads if Aslan hadn't been there." And Susan says, "I should think not." And that's the point. When Aslan is there, when Christ is in the center, that which was not of God, that which was shadowed or fallen or broken in those old mythologies, is cast out. But that which was of God comes to the fore and shines.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, this is very Pauline and it's very patristic too. So, Paul talks about Christ's eschatological victory over the cosmos, not so much as destruction, but as subordination of the powers, right? And then Origen says in book 3 of the De Principiis, he says that Christ's primacy over the cosmos is realized by giving the medicine of salvation to those who had fallen and restoring the discipline of ruling to the powers, right? Yeah. So what do we see in the Christian cultus historically? And we can wrap this back around to Arthur. We see that paganism is not it's not obliterated, right? Like it's absorbed and it becomes the new language of the Gentile churches. Yeah.
In fact, of course, this notion of the powers, is really important and is very, very much there, for example, in Lewis's Ransom trilogy, the Oyasu and both the heavenly planetary deities and their earthly types can come to the Pendragon and to Merlin and become part of the divine providence. But that's in obedience. But there is one who cannot do that, the fallen Usiarch of our own planet, who is silent. So there is real evil. It's not syncretistic in the sense of, if it moves, affirm it, that's fine. There is a challenge from Christ, and Christ breaks the powers of hell. But having done so, then certain powers which are not of hell, but may have been under that shadow, can be set free in him, free from hell, but not free in the sense of anarchically free, but under the subordination of Christ. So this whole thing of how do you take all that stuff and bring it to Christ, that is the very task, in my view, that Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach and all these other writers set themselves. They had this massive material, some of which already had Christian elements of it, some of which didn't, which clearly included the realm of fairy and, characters like the Green Knight or Morgan Le Fay or the various ladies of the lake are clearly out of the Pagos, the pagan inheritance. Arthur is clearly a Christian king. Merlin is a very interestingly intermediate figure who is obedient to a Christian king and who forwards the coming of a Christian king, but is allegedly, and according to some detractors, a son of the devil. But in fact, I think in most versions of the story, he's a son of one of the Longavias, as Lewis calls them in the discarded image. Is a daemon, Daemon, not Demon. So there's something more than human, but also something less than human about Merlin. And of course, Lewis makes a whole study of precisely that ambiguity in That Hideous Strength, where the baddies who genuinely are in league with the devil assume that Merlin will be on their side, and they're very shocked to discover that in fact he's not. And that's the point of the story. It's a rebuke to precisely that kind of totalizing ultra-reform Christianity that wants to exclude everything that's not a short doctrinal formula that you learned in your catechism, and is banishing the whole of culture and saying, no, you can't do that. All these things are given to Christ. They must be brought to Christ. Bringing them to Christ is a long, loving labor of discernment. And that's what these early Arthurian authors, in my opinion, were doing, but needs to be done again in an age.
Yeah, so maybe before getting to the Inklings, then, who we've already had ample chance to talk about. Yeah. So Tolkien would remind us a tree is not just a tree, right? Barfield would remind us that mythic consciousness has greater access to the fundamental truth of things. I've heard you talk in a couple of interviews about this sort of thing, right? That if we approach the world in a way that is more, what I would label almost more like animist or panpsychist or Platonic, right? Of everything, because everything is full of God, because everything is full of God's spirit, everything is full of possible gods, and everything is full of minimally possible spirits, right? I'm curious, what you think about, does Arthuriana help us make this connection? So Lewis writes about the Longawi, various contemporary authors have written on, I'm thinking of some charming essays that David Bentley Hart has written on fairies and mermaids, or that Stephen R.L. Clark has written on fairies. Does Arthuriana help us to sort of re-enchant our imaginations from the sources, or do we have to go through the modern, how do we affect that contemporary synthesis?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I entirely understand and approve of what might broadly be called a program of re-enchantment, but with one caveat. I'm not happy with the words re-enchantment itself, because it suggests that the world is in fact not enchanted, that it's actually intrinsically disenchanted, and that only we, by some wonderful spell of our art, can re-enchant it. And I don't think it's that way around at all. We are the people, if anything, who are under a kind of cold spell of the delusive thing, the non-real thing, is the materialist construct, That's certainly what Barfield would say, that we've had a series of false figurations in which we've imposed with our own consciousness a dead mechanism, clockwork carapace over what is in fact a living exchange of divine energies. So it's not up to us to re-enchant the world. The world is in fact right now completely enchanted in that earlier sense of the world, and is alive with things and meaning and purpose and beauty and spirit. What we have to do is remove the veil, which our own, this is what Coleridge said. Coleridge said, you know, we must remove the film of familiarity which our selfishness and solicitude has cast over things. I've just written a book which is coming out in the autumn called Lifting the Veil, which is about the imagination and the gospel, I'm suggesting that we're much more about recovering an awareness of an existing state of things, rather than making that state of things suddenly happen by our own imaginative work. That the imagination is not making a new enchantment, it's able at last to perceive an enchantment that is already there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so would you say that the Arthuriad is good pedagogy for reteaching ourselves that, or for breaking our own kind of
I think reading the stories is itself to be enchanted. And, you know, like I was told as a child, and I played, and, you know, there's a bit of me that whenever I go into a wood, particularly if I happen to come across an old chapel in a wood, you know, how can that not be enchanting? How can that not be a moment when, you know, a half-sleeping Lancelot might see the lights in the chapel and see the knight born on the litter and the Grail come out? You know, how can, of course. And these things can happen. I mean, there's a famous, well, perhaps it's not famous unless you're a David Jones fan, but, you know, David Jones has an amazing chapel in the Wasteland episode in Parenthesis, which is his long prose poem about his experiences as a private soldier in the Great War. But it's when Private Jones, was sent out gathering in a devastated bit of land where a French village had been practically bombed into smithereens, and there was a no man's land between the two fronts, and just these ruins and the broken barren trees, and Private Jones gets sent out by his sergeant to gather firewood to bring back to make fires in the trenches for them, keep the men warm. And he's walking, you know, a disconsolate soldier, still bearing his arms, you know, in this desolate landscape. And of course, he's completely soaked in Arthuriana. I mean, he's a Welshman, why should he not? So he can't help, in a sense, but be Lancelot in the wasteland. And then he sees an old chapel. This actually happened to him, you know, near Mamet's Wood. And there are lights in it. And he goes and looks through the cracks in it and finds a priest and 4 or 5 French peasants who've schlepped themselves out of their ruined village. And the priest has brought candlesticks and laid the altar and is celebrating the Eucharist. And at that point, David Jones becomes a Christian, looking through the thing, because in the midst of this utter devastation, this primal mythic thing is actually happening. And, you know, and so he then retells that with full, you know, for those with eyes to see it, Arthurian, you know, things on. And he goes on to carry on using Arthurian motifs in the rest of his poetry. And that image of the chapel in the ruins and the Eucharist in the midst of all the devastation shining out is for me a symbol among many. Obviously, it's primarily a symbol of the presence of Christ in the world, but it's also a symbol to me. This is the idea of the hidden Grail, that anywhere and at any moment, the resplendence and refulgence of God might shine out through our devastations. And we should be questing for it.
So I'm curious, specifically while we're on the topic of, Christianity and the Eucharist and worship. So you're an Anglican priest. I was just briefly Anglican, and then I did a very Anglican thing, which is I fell in love with Eastern Christianity.
Yeah.
And
Take.
Sorry.
Of course, that seems to be a path that many take. Of course, there are many affinities between, the Caroline divines, the great early Anglican theologians, particularly Lancelot Andrewes, in whom I specialized. And I mean, the best book on Lancelot Andrewes was written by an Orthodox theologian, Losky,
and Eastern Christianity, for me, I like to describe myself sometimes as like a, Saints Sergius and Alban Christian, kind of thinking back on that society. But I'm curious, so like Anglicans habitually debate, the center, the contours, the general meaning of being Anglican as a communion, as a Christian ethos. This is both Anglicanism's like unique genius and also like sometimes its vice. And in sort of Anglican related expressions of Christianity, I'm thinking of like the ordinariates in the Catholic Church. There's something that people debate about called the quote unquote Anglican patrimony. Debates about, is this just Anglican liturgy? Does it include Anglican theology? Does it include like a cultural ethos? I'm curious to what extent you would say that Arthur and Logres and the Matter of Britain, do these belong to the identity and ethos, not just of like Britishness, but specifically, is this at the heart of like what it is to be like a British Christian or an Anglican Christian? Like, does this belong to that?
Okay. So I think there are two answers to that. The first is nobody possesses these things. And it was a European literature. When Dante's in the Inferno and he meets Paolo and Francesca, and they tell the story of how they came to fall in love, they were reading about Lancelot and Guinevere. I mean, the Arthuriad is in the Divine Comedy. I mean, it's all over Europe. So in that sense, in the same way that, we are formed by Homer and Virgil, we don't happen to be, Greek or Roman. So there's a gift to the world from the Arthuriad. I just want to say that first, because I would never want to seem to be having some imperious proprietorial thing about that. So that's the first thing to be said. But then it certainly has to be said that it is the matter of Britain, in the sense that the Iliad and the Odyssey are the matter of Troy. And the stories of Charlemagne are the matter of Gaul. So I do think that there is something distinctly British, taking the British Isles as a whole, not just England, obviously. The stories start in Wales. Lots of them are set in Northumberland, bits of them in Scotland. I mean, we've got the Queen of Orkney all over the place in these stories, So they are the matter of Britain, and Britain is a very, very mysterious place. It is, Ultima Thule. It once, as Chesterton said, it had the highly poetic privilege of being the edge of the world. And that's also part of the point. The point, as these storytellers tell it, certainly the way Williams saw it, was the beautiful signature of Christ about the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and his attention to margins and to the least, that his return in and through the Sangreal is to come in this odd place. And of course, you get the Glastonbury legend and the ideas that he'd come to England as a child, and then you get the idea that Joseph of Arimathea brings these things and then sets up a hidden secret community where the hallows are passed on generation and generation until Arthur and eventually Galahad come. That's the fulfillment of something that started. So those stories have been around with us for ages, and they have shaped us. And I think every retelling by an Englishman and by an English Christian of the Arthurian stuff, or by a British Christian, has to be a meditation on land and landscape and place and identity, as well as a meditation on the universal things of the truths of the gospel. Truths of the gospel have to be truths bodied forth in a particular place. It's not a vague, it's a universal religion, but it's not a vague, placeless, cosmopolitan religion. It's actually about place. So those things have to come into play. And one of the things two things I'll tell you. Maybe it's relevant at this point for me to tell you a little bit about my own poetic project. Having written academically, for the Arthur and the Inklings book and various things about this, I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. I actually want to retell the story myself. And it took me a long time to find the form. And I was originally under the influence of Williams and David Jones, going down the high, abstruse, or highly elusive kind of ultra arcane or high modernist route, and I was going to do a multi-layered text, which was my basic idea was that what if the matter of Britain, that is to say the subject matter of the Arthuriad, was also the matter of Britain, actual physical matter of Britain. What if instead of I telling the story, what if the place, all the Arthurian places, all the, Tintagel and Glastonbury and every place that has an Arthurian name, what if I walked to all of these places and I wrote a story in which I tell you what it's like to be in Britain now, walking these roads. And then in each place, I sing a love song to the place, or I write a poem to the place. And then the place itself, with its own voice, tells the bit of the story that it has to tell. And that was my original plan. In the end, I didn't do it because I actually thought I was imposing myself too much on the material, and that would be more honest and workmanlike and more humble towards this prime story, which is greater and wiser than I am, really just to tell the story and trust that my telling the story as a contemporary British Christian now, it would naturally have these links and I wouldn't have to so insistently layer them in. So that was one, that's why I hesitated for a long time. And then I was asked actually by the Rabbit Room Press to contribute to a book they're producing called The Lost Tales of Galahad, which picks up on a bit in Malory, where after Galahad has encountered Percival and Lancelot in the wild woods, in the waste woods, and actually overthrown them, but nobody knows who anybody is, and then he rides off. Malory says he had many other adventures, but there isn't space here to tell them. So the remit for this book was tell a story about Galahad that fits into this part, but is not a Grail story. So it's not, don't retell anything in Malory. It has to be a completely new story. So in order to do this, just for fun, I just did it more as a jeu d'esprit. I decided, because I'd done this extensive study of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which included a careful think through of how Coleridge appropriated and reformed and made a new use of the ballad form. So I was very familiar with the possibilities of the ballad form. So I decided to write it as a ballad, and I wrote a ballad called Galahad and the Naiad, which was a kind of partly also an ecological thing, which is, I think, the other great piece of hidden wisdom that's there in the Arthuriad with the ladies of the lake and so on. So I wrote this piece, and it flowed very well. So I suddenly thought, this is unlocking the dam. I can do this. So I decided not long after that to undertake a retelling of the Arthuriad in ballad form, and in a ballad form that would allow popular reading and allow kids to read it, I don't know, the kind of kids that love the Narnia stories or the Harry Potter books or read The Hobbit to read it, but would also have loads for the adults, and would be in a complex intertextual relationship with Malory, but not in a way that imposed in any way on the pleasure of just reading it as a story. So that was the plan, and it still is the plan. And I decided, because I feel the Grail is so central, because I didn't know whether it would go, I decided to start by writing the whole thing from the coming of Galahad and the coming of the Grail to Camelot through to the achievement of the Grail. And I'm about a third of the way through that. I conceive it in 3 books, and I've written the first, and I'm now about a third of the way, maybe half through the second. Now something will come out of that to do with the fact that I'm an Anglican priest. As it happens, obviously, A.E. Waite, who wrote The Secret Church of the Holy Grail, and Charles Williams were both high church Anglicans. The other person of that period who wrote about the Grail in a very fascinating new way in the book, The Column of Dust, was the mystic and fine Anglican writer about mysticism. God, my mind's gone blank. Yeah, wonderful woman.
Evelyn Underhill, by chance?
Yeah, Evelyn Underhill, thank you. Yeah. Was it Pleshy? Yeah. So Evelyn Underhill, those would be three Anglican spiritual writers pushing against the comparative religion. It's all just no different from any other pagan thing. Of course they're saying it's pagan, but it's more than that. So I'm drawing from them. I'm drawing from Malory, of course. I'm drawing from Malory's sources. and I also have in my mind, I don't know quite how it'll come across, these extraordinary resonances of which David Jones was aware.
Yeah. So I think I'm interested by sort of several interlocking ideas in that answer. So one thing that interests me is I fully agree with you on the notion of, Christianity has to be embodied in a particular place. It has to be enculturated. It has to sort of put down roots. I think one of the big difficulties for converts to Orthodoxy, I also think, though, with Americans who are either in the Episcopal Church or in one of the Anglican breakaway churches, one of the difficulties is that our country, at least as it currently exists, is fairly young. And trying to do a fully enculturated version of old world Christianities is often very difficult. So, for example, there's one sense in which an Orthodox Christian who goes to liturgy throughout the year or something in America is substantially practicing the same religion as, say, like a Greek on Cyprus. And then there's another sense in which the religion of the latter person is actually very different from the American convert, right? There's a whole ethos, there's a whole culture, there's a whole sense of being Orthodox that's sort of culturally irreplaceable. There's an asymptote of
village life. It's to do with Mediterranean food and drink and social life as well.
There's a whole thing to it. And I think too with Anglicanism, I think what I encountered was, when I was there, I wanted to be very like high church Anglo-Catholic, like that was kind of what I was interested in. And what I found was both in the Episcopal Church and in the more like evangelical kind of, conservative or continuing Anglican communities, I didn't find a lot of buy-in to that because for a lot of people, it wasn't culturally familiar, it wasn't American, whatever being American is, right? And so I'm thinking about this in terms of, in my context, where culturally speaking, my country is currently trying to come to terms with the fact that we are intrinsically a very pluralistic country. We have a lot of weird and conflicting and often kind of shameful overlapping histories. There's a sense in which, like, I read the Arthuriad and I read the Matter of Britain, and I feel a deep kind of like connection in my soul to this, of like, this really feeds me. This really enchants my view of the world. This really
truly enchanting. I mean, it
is. As
a meeting of fairy and our world, and yet with an in Christ. That doesn't get better than that in a way.
Right.
That you have extraordinary awareness of nature. You have an awareness of the magical and kindling elements that were there in the pre-Christian thing and are there in the surviving stories of elves and fairies, and you have Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And these things are brought into a kind of harmony in the way the stories are written.
And it seems to me that synthesis is the product, right, of a long enculturation of Christianity into the British Isles.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's the product of this deep history of interaction with, melding with, assumption of the pre-existing pagan cultures there, response to new waves of, new cultures coming to the British Isles and integrating and everything else. So I'm wondering for like Americans, right? And this is maybe kind of a bigger version of the observation that, many of the Americans who are like very interested in C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, I'm one of them, are people who temperamentally, like Lewis and Tolkien, may not have actually liked, right? Like they're
well, I don't know. That might not be true. I mean, Lewis did have many American friends whom he really did like as well. So, yeah. Can I just go back to something you said earlier?
Please. Yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling, but
No. Well, right at the beginning, setting up this whole particular bit of discourse, you happen to say, of course, America is a young country. And this is the problem. It hasn't got these deep roots. Now, that's true only insofar as you think of America as the life of the European settlers. But obviously it's a very, very old country indeed. And there have been people in it for a long time. And I think one of the missed opportunities, one of the missed moments from the Pilgrim Fathers onwards through to the Spanish settlers down was there could have been, obviously, was that there was a tragic and horrible and genocidal encounter with the Native American people. Not totally genocidal, thanks be to God, they still survive, and many of their stories still survive. I'm more familiar with the stories of the West Coast first citizens that are Canadians. But basically, just as the Arthuriad combines early British mythological life with the insights of the gospel and, you know, all the things. So there was a mythology already here, which found its way in and was reframed in the light of Christ, I would say. So I think there's huge and wonderful possibility in bringing all the different kinds of American Christianity they are. And I have very deep empathy with, you know, the Anglican and indeed the Orthodox, or, you know, neo-Orthodox, we want to call it. And I realize that needs to be related to American culture in the sense of the culture of your coffee shops and cars. But I also think it has to be related to the land and the memory of the land and the stories. And I think there are many, many motifs in indigenous mythology in North America, which could have extraordinarily beautiful and fruitful encounter with the gospel. And there are some examples of that happening. And I remember I was really impressed when I went to do a conference for the Glen workshops, as they're called, in New Mexico, in wonderful, really rich, resonant landscape of the kind of Cristo de Sangre Mountains. There was a healing shrine, which is kind of, I think, like the sort of Lords of New Mexico. I'm trying to remember what it's called. Anyway, I went to it with the Orthodox poet Scott Cairns. We made a pilgrimage to it together. And it was very, and, you know, made our prayers there. And but the story around that is about how, you know, a Native American Pueblo resident, you know, poor farmer finds a cross and assumes it in the earth, and he assumes it's been left by the missionaries, and he takes it back, you know, to the missionary station, and they put it on the altar, and then the next day it's right back there in the dirt again, and it happens 3 times, and then they build a shrine around where it was found, and there are healings, and there are all kinds of stories in which you feel the feel for the land and the dust and the dirt that those native people had is now blossoming into a feel for who Christ is and how he's the grain of wheat that falls into the earth. And do you know what I mean? Something beautiful is happening there. And there's this shrine, and it was a shrine of and for the people rather than for the Spanish priests. And the story is also about a Spanish priest who had the grace to see what was going on and see that it was a work of Christ. So that's just an example. I wish I could remember the name of the place. I have here, Scott Cairns and I knelt down in the place where this cross had been and took some of the dust from it and prayed and brought it home. I have it on my desk. I just thought it was sacred ground. So it may be that the way forward into the deeper or mythic resonances is going to depend on a deep cultural recognition and much deeper reconciliation with the traditions of the people of the land who were there before the European settlers arrived. But it's early days in American history. There's plenty of time for happening. Of course, that will happen. And then the other thing that must happen is the racial reconciliation with the former slaves. But again, they have already met with Christianity in such a powerful way and produced in gospel do you know what I mean? There's something there still waiting to happen, I think.
Well, and so this is one of the things that I really enjoyed about you know, David Lowery's The Green Knight, which just came out. I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't seen it yet. Is it any good?
Yeah. Oh, it's fantastic.
I'm always nervous because I love The Green Knight so much. I'm really afraid of, you know, watching a film and thinking it might not be good. But I was afraid of the Lord of the Rings ones, and they were good. So, you know, it was.
No. It's a fantastic movie, and it was made by someone who clearly is familiar both with the original and with the scholarship on it, and who has thought deeply about what he wanted to do in an adaptation. One of the things that stood out to me about it is that, you know, the main the primary actor for Sir Gawain is played by Dev Patel, right?
Right. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, you know, like you're taking this character from Arthurian myth and you're making him the important one for the movie, a person of color, right?
Well, of course, that's there in Mallory as well, because you have Palomides, who's the Paynim knight, who is, as it were, you know, in this case, in Mallory, is sort of Muslim. It's kind of extraordinary in it. I mean, he's christened eventually, but, you know, there's all kinds of things going on there.
Yeah, yeah. And so I really like what you were saying about how, you know, to come, like if there's ever going to be a sort of matter of America, so to speak, the primary cultures that it needs to be working with are indigenous cultures, you know, African cultures, immigrant cultures. One of the things that has to happen, I think, is that, you know, America's concept of whiteness, of this sort of assimilative, you know, mass European identity that's, I mean, really sort of a fiction, right? It's like it's completely fictitious. I mean, when my ancestors came here from southern Italy, you know, they weren't white people in the eyes of the country. They were, you know, they were like swarthy Catholic Europeans, right? They were the kind that the U.S. generally didn't want. So for me, I think, you know, I want to know what it would look like for Christianity to actually fully enculturate here. What David?
Yes, I think it'd be very exciting. You have to take the long view. If you think about the rich layers of Arthurian, if we just look at Arthurian literature, right? Just think of the number of languages it's written in and the cultures. So you've got these Welsh triads, these early Welsh triads, which mention Myrddin and a figure who may or may not be Arthur, mainly in kind of people having conversations with eagles, you know, riddling conversations with eagles. That's what, you know. Now, that's a deep, very different, profound Celtic culture. When the Anglo-Saxons rock up, and it's the Anglo-Saxons that Arthur is fighting in his Welsh stories, it's a total culture clash. They've got these Northern European gods and goddesses. They're really ruled by Weird and Woden and, you know, and Fricka and Freya and Ask and Ember, all that lot. You know, it couldn't be more different from Morrigan and the Tedanu and all of the kind of Irish Welsh stuff. But somehow or other, in spite of their initial terrible conflicts, they become a culture that for both of whom the figure of Arthur is important. And then you get the Normans coming in. And because the Normans have just defeated the Saxons, they're interested in Arthur because Arthur is a pre-Saxon king. And if they can claim a bit of that Arthurian magic, then that kind of legitimizes them. But also they love the stories. They totally love the stories. So up steps Geoffrey of Monmouth and says, you know, have I got stories for you? And, you know, away they go. And then the stories spread in Anglo-Norman culture because, of course, the language of the quote unquote English court at that point is French. And, you know, we own half of France anyway. I mean, it's, you know, so it's a mixed thing. So all these stories spread out through France. Meantime, the Germans, who are our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, you know, get hold of it and start doing Parsifal and all of that. And the Italians get a piece of the action as well. And Dante is like a total Arthur fan. So you get all this, but going back to England, we start with Welsh, then we have a Latin text, then we have an Anglo-Norman text. Then finally, in Gawain and the Green Knight and the Illiterate Mother, we have an English text. And then these are all brought together in a late Middle English text by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Sorry, not by Geoffrey, by Thomas Mallory, who's constantly acknowledging that they're from the French book. And then, you know, Caxton prints that and then Milton picks it up and, you know, you're away. So the thing we think of as this beautiful, homogenous, deeply rooted British Arthur has only become who he is and is still, you know, the Rex Quondam, Rex Futuro, because he is precisely the sign of how the different levels and cultures met together. And you actually see that in the stories. You know, on the one hand, you've got Lancelot and Guinevere, who are highly sophisticated, you know, flowerings of medieval courtly culture, which is a mixture of Latin and French and and an amour courtoise that came out of Provence. And then walking right into it, you get A Lady of the Lake, or you get Morgan Le Fay, whose name, Morgan Le Fay, clearly goes back to Morrigan, you know, the Irish goddess of battle and war, whose other manifestation is always a crow or a raven. And I mean, the Irish epics, the phrase, when the blood of the soldiers is spilt on the field, they say the field is rich with milk for Morrigan, you know, so that the crows can drink the blood. And that's who she is. But she rocks up as Morgan Le Fay, an enchantress. But you can see just underneath the shimmer of the French courtly clothes is clearly a perilous and fey goddess who's just from the Celtic world, who's walking around in this story. But she has a place in the story, and she has a significant place in the story. And amazingly, in Malory, considering how much she's apparently worked against the court of Arthur in Malory's narrative, she is nevertheless one of the three queens who appears on the barge to lament Arthur and to carry him to Avalon. There's something extraordinary going on there about sort of reconciliation. So when I came to retell these stories, I did have another agenda. Obviously, our island is going through a massive moment, which has been predicated around I mean, we've had our own populism of a sort. We've had one of these periodic shudders against Europe and revolutions against it, and yet we are still part of Europe. So we've left. There's been a certain kind of xenophobic English nationalism going on, which is not attractive. I love England. I love England to her roots and bones, and you know, for me, so I'm deeply patriotic in the sense that my motherland is I care, but I'm not in the least attracted by the political manifestations of English xenophobia, which is racist and suspicious of all foreigners and all of that. But I notice they often use the Red Cross. They often use the St. George's flag. And of course, the St. George's, the Red Cross Knight, the Red Cross Knight is another, that it's the red cross on the white field, which Galahad bears on his shield. So I'm really trying to wrest the Arthurian story back from the narrow-minded Little England nationalists and make it still a love song to and the great forming myth of my nation, but also recognize its supernatural resonances and its European reach.
Yeah, I love the notion, and this occurs to me the more deeply I go into the Arthuriad, that it's always an abuse of Arthur stories to take Arthur as some sort of expression of xenophobia, because if you think about it, right, I mean, Arthur himself is a Romanized Brit, right? he's
the Romanic British, general. That's the historical Arthur. I mean, I'm very much dealing with the mythological Arthur, though I am, of course, very interested.
Right. And I mean, British identity is just intrinsically, it seems to me, at least from the historical perspective, it is many layers, right? It is many layers of different cultural.
It is precisely. I mean, we are a nation, properly speaking, of immigrants, in the sense that obviously human life, didn't originate in the British Isles. So we all came here from somewhere, and that's part of our story. I'm just wondering whether it might be appropriate to just give you a little sample of what is going to be the prelude poem to what I do.
That would be wonderful.
Because we might be kind of coming towards the end. And this is I'm trying to reconcile in this my original plan, which was that the land itself tells the story, and I still feel that, but I'm going to have to come to it in a slightly more subtle way than I had originally planned in this, this very heavily constructed and layered thing, which I think was actually smelled too much of the study and not enough of the kind of lifting lilt of the ballad. And I'm composing quite a lot of this whilst walking in English landscapes. I'm able to compose in my mind. I have a reasonably retentive memory, and it's a practice that I know Wordsworth and Tennyson both had, that they would retain and come back and write it down, but compose it. It's a bit like a painter painting it on plein air. See if I've okay, so this is called Take Up the Tale. As I walked out one morning, all in the soft fine rain, it seemed as though a silver veil was shining over hill and vale, as though some lovely long lost spell had made all new again. And through that shimmer in the air, I seemed to hear a sound, as though a distant horn were blown in some lost land that I had known, that seemed to speak from tree and stone, and echo all around. And with the music came these words: "Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale this land still keeps. In earth and water magic sleeps. The dryad sighs, the naiad weeps, but you can lift the veil. From where the waves wash Cornwall's caves, out to the Horse Vale, the lands still hold the tale of old, like hidden treasure, buried gold. Once more the story must be told. Poet, take up the tale. Tell of the king who will return. Tell of the Holy Grail. Tell of old knights and chivalry. Tell of the pristine mystery of Merlin's Isle of Gramarye. Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale of courtesy, take up the tale of grace, revive the land's long memory, summon the fair folk, let them be. Something of fairy, wild and free, still lingers in this place. Lift up your eyes to see the light on Glastonbury Tor. Then come down from that far green hill to where the sacred waters spill and shine within the chalice well, and listen to their lore. Yea, listen well before you start. Be still ere you begin. See through the surface round about, the noise, the rush, the fear, the doubt. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. You may yet walk through Merlin's Isle, by oak and ash and thorn. The ancient hills do not forget, and you might wake their wisdom yet. Who knows what wonders might be met on this midsummer morn? So, I have taken up the tale, to tell it full and free, the tale that makes my heart rejoice. I tell it, for I have no choice. I tell it till another voice takes up the tale from me. So that's the prelude to the whole thing. And in a sense, I would say it's part of tradition, you know, it's passed on.
Yeah. Well, Malcolm, I think that's an excellent place to close for today. I had a ton of fun doing this. I hope you'll agree to do this again sometime.
It's fun to do. I'm sorry for the interruptions in the middle, but yeah.
No,
great. Okay, it's fun, and I hope you let me know when you've done it and edited and put it up, and send me the link and stuff.
Absolutely, will do.
I look forward to meet you with your various projects. Okay.
Thank you.
God bless.
God bless.
Bye.